if you have 150 people listening to your show and those 150 people are responsible for making purchasing decisions that are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, which a lot of these executives are, then the value of that listener is significantly more. And when the value of that listener and the action that they potentially might take is very high, then you're able to command a much higher rate than I ever made in sports and entertainment. I now make with a logistics podcast. And I don't think a lot of podcasters are thinking about it from that lens.
Okay. I have no idea how to start the show.
Should probably use that as like a line. I don't know how to start this. We don't know the name of the show, but
that's the way we're just going to start it. So, You know what? I'm going to take a page from all of my podcasts. Yo! Welcome to the JPU show, the new JPU show, which, as you know, we're workshopping on a name. Maybe that'll be the first contest we do, is help us come up with a name for this show, and we'll give you something. But welcome to the new JPU show. My name is Badr Milligan. I'm one of your hosts, and I've got the incredible, amazing, and beautiful Blythe as my co-host as well.
Why did you mumble the beautiful part? Should enunciate it.
The beautiful Blythe.
Thank you.
Now you got to take that applause. I can't stop it.
Thank you. Thank
lavish in it. Okay, wow. Like we've recorded a few episodes together where we've had, friends of the community on the show. We've had other podcasters. We've even had folks from the amazing Buzzsprout team on the podcast. But this is a new entry. I was jokingly saying this is the new JPU show, but it is, for lack of better terms. Do you want to, I guess, give your take on this new era, this new chapter of the JPU?
Well, I think, in order to have a podcaster community, I think it's probably pretty vital or pretty important that we have a podcast about the podcast community. So, for the sake of, everybody has a podcast now. We both have at least a couple that we are a part of. And so it's just a natural evolution. And I think for the two of us, we know how much work a podcast takes. And I think that's, with the JPU being around for 5 years, it has taken... I think we're finally at that point where it's like, okay, we have a good grasp on what the business is and what we want from the business in the future. But to get there, we really have to start the actual podcast for the community as well. And so we have a lot of thoughts, a lot of ideas around this, but ultimately the value of this show was really speaking from the podcaster's perspective. We are both, I would say, successful podcasters. There's a variety of ways to determine success, but we have successfully managed having a podcast in addition to having a full-time job, and the difficulties around balancing that and co-hosts, and do you have co-hosts or do you go at it solo? I've done it a couple different ways. But just knowing that perspective, I'm really excited to share. It's almost like the method of for podcasters by podcasters, because you will see, and I'm sure a lot of folks out there have seen, a lot of podcasts that, they start off with great intentions and hoping to teach you things, but the podcast is more about teaching you things instead of teaching you things from in the trenches, if that makes sense. Being able to make a show successful before you talk about teaching how to podcast, I think, is very important. And that's exactly what we bring to this. And so that's where our differentiator is that we're going to be using this show to talk everybody else through what has been successful for us. Everything might not work for you, but you might be able to pull some nuggets of information from what has worked and what hasn't worked from our experience.
Well said. And I think just to sprinkle a little more to that, I think the goal is to speak to the podcasters that are in the trenches, which seems to be like our favorite phrase anytime we have one of our podcaster meetups. Like big shout out to Babo, who told me that he loves that phrase. He uses it all the time. But I think the goal for this new, more consistent, and I think keyword, the goal is to be a little more consistent with these recordings, is to speak to the podcasters that are in the trenches, who create their shows by hand, that might have a more focused niche topic, by sharing, practical advice that we use, as well as behind the scenes stories about our personal podcast journeys and the things that work and don't work. I think that's one of my favorite things about our meetups and talking to aspiring and beginning podcasters is talking about the things that work, but also like the things that don't work. Like when you consider that between us two, we've got a combined 20 plus years of just running podcasts. And then that's not counting, 6 years of podcaster networking events and educational things like that. I think there's a lot that we can share. And I don't know. I love being able to tell people I've tried this and it bombed in my face, and I would do that like this now, and you have the opportunity to do it. So I think you mentioned, this being a podcast for the 9 to 5 podcaster, but also like the 5 to 9 podcaster. So maybe podcasting isn't your full-time thing. Maybe you aspire to be, or maybe you're comfortable like I am, where it's like I have a full-time job, but I spend equally, just an equal amount of time building the podcast, and I do get some sort of revenue from it. So I think wherever you are in your podcast journey, I think there's definitely something you'll pick up from here. And if you happen to be from the hometown of Jax, then I think there's a lot, this will really get you excited, because we'll also be sharing updates and news and what we got going on for the Jax Podcasters United. And, I've got a little secret goal where I wouldn't mind if maybe, this show blows up or catches the attention of someone and we get more out of towners to come attend one of our Jax Podcaster meetups. Like, how cool has it been throughout the years of hosting our meetups where it's folks from Tampa or what was it, like Georgia, Brunswick, and all that, like immediate eras show up, and I don't know, there's something about, that's one of my goals, is hopefully we get to inspire someone that's within the area that wants to meet up and meet us in the team. So I think that is a good intro as ever. Since this is the first episode of this new JPU show, we've agreed that the format will be that every episode will both bring, whether it be a news piece in the podcasting world or bring up a question or topic that ties into our process and what we've done. And you get the honors of kicking off the first main topic of the first news show. So what do you got for us, Blythe?
Well, I'm actually going to do I guess almost polar opposite of this and go and talk about a YouTuber, because that is essentially where a lot of where if you've seen any kind of like JPU social, we are both on social for our respective podcasts. So the idea of like starting up more social channels for another company is just, maybe you can just see the look, or if you're listening, you can just know that like rubbing my forehead as I'm talking about this. But from the YouTube perspective, I love YouTube. This show will be on YouTube in case people want to watch the video version of it. But this YouTuber, her name is called Gabby Bell, and I love her. I love her editing style. I love the content that she talks about. And she had a video recently that says, "Why is everyone starting a podcast?" And the video is, it's about, I would say, 8 months old, but really, really great insight of what she covers in this video, where she talks about the popularity surge in the 2000s. There's a low barrier of entry for starting a show, but then also that the fact that what is really a podcast anymore has evolved from just the audio only version that was kind of started in like 1999 or something, I think was the first podcast ever published. But then, with the 2000s, of course, with, a lot of radio shows broadcasting live, Ustream, I think what was very popular back in the day for a lot of my favorite radio stations. They would also simulcast on Ustream, and that was a way that you could listen to, shout out to Lex and Terry. They were the first people that ever, put me in front of a microphone, but they used to put their show on Ustream. And so that was a really good thing in my opinion, because I'm not able to catch the show, from 7 to 10 a.m. or whatever hours that they were on. I think it was actually 6 to 10 a.m. But then they started doing the Ustream, and that was a way that I could listen on demand. And at the time I worked a landscaping job. And so that was my first sort of foray into the world of podcasting, was getting a Ustream account and being able to listen to the radio show while I did landscaping work. And I hated when that stream would end, because then I'm just, I just got to go back to like music, I guess, which isn't like the worst thing in the world. But it was got
to cut grass in silence.
and pick weeds, and it was just one of those things. But she goes into the video podcast popularity and how you essentially can't really have well, you can, but you can't really have a podcast if you don't have the video component to it. And so
it almost seems like outdated. I'm sorry, it almost seems like outdated at this point if you don't have a video component, because how often, I feel like that's a topic we're seeing a lot more of new podcasters that come to our events is, so are we going to talk about YouTube, and do I need to be on video? And I think we've always said, I mean, if you want to, like there's a lot more that goes into it. But yeah, I feel like in this day and age, when people ask, oh, you have a podcast? I think their immediate, more often than not, their real question is, are you on YouTube?
Right. And this is coming from this Gabby Bell. She is a YouTuber first. Now, she does have a podcast where it's a little bit more casual. She's not doing this really hardcore editing where it's like sound design and B-roll and all of that extra stuff that you have to worry about when it comes to YouTube editing. But just from her lens, she was coming at it from a YouTuber's perspective, is it just feels like everybody has a podcast. But in reality, the overwhelming majority of podcasts never make it past 10 episodes. The overwhelming majority of podcasts in Apple and in Spotify, they are dormant. So they're not actively publishing regular new episodes. And so I think that's where the only part of the video that I disagreed with a little bit is that it does feel like everybody has a podcast. But when you think about the longevity of the overwhelming majority of these shows, a lot of different shows only have seasons, or they do one season and they're done. I think it's something crazy. I think Buzzsprout has a stat like 90% of all podcasts never make it past 10 episodes. So if you've gone past that marker, then you are doing better than most. And for us, it sort of just brings up the topic of, well, why did we actually start a podcast? Why do you podcast? And that was sort of the ethos of what could be a great first topic for this new show.
Yeah, I think that sets us up for a good little, reintroduction, considering, this might be reaching someone that doesn't know us from all the meetups. Do you want to take that first? I guess, why do you still podcast?
Sure. So I started podcasting at a very a vengeful reason. I was working in radio and I wanted more airtime, and I wanted it in a way that I was very particular about how I wanted more airtime, and the station wouldn't give it to me. And so I got a little pissed off and I went home and started a podcast. Because I figured, well, if you're not going to give me a seat at the table, then I'll make my own. And that, I think, is sort of the beauty of podcasting. Now, eventually, I do have to give the station full credit, because they did eventually find a way to work me in to how I would best perform. And the way that I wanted to perform is that I wanted to be on air. I wanted to be giving my opinion. I didn't want to be like a news chick, sort of reading the news and passing it off to, sort of the male host that can give their opinion and give their perspective. I wanted to be right there in the thick of it with them. So that role eventually would open up for me, but I'm thankful that initially I took the leap in taking the podcasting journey. Now, a lot of those shows are not very good. Whether I was hosting it by myself, or what I would do back in the day is take our current radio show that we were already filming or already recording, and I would go to the producer. The producer would hand me a little storage drive, and I would go home, and that's where the show would be. And we didn't have any of the local commercials because that's just the way radio software works, is that you have your radio broadcasts and then you have your commercials, which is two different types of software. So the commercials weren't on the file that he gave me. And so for, I would say, probably my first 20 episodes that I uploaded, there were these 6-minute long breaks of radio silence. And that was the podcast that I uploaded. And I think you were actually the first person to tell me, do you know that this is happening? And I said, I mean, as you can imagine, 30 seconds of silence when you're listening to a show feels like something's wrong. You're checking your phone, but I had 6 minutes. And I had several 6-minute breaks in every single upload. So that was a very hard lesson learned, but wouldn't trade it all, because it put me on the path I am today. Eventually it evolved into, because it started off as sports and entertainment, anybody who's in sports entertainment, you know that that's a really tough market to crack and really tough one to monetize because your competition is younger and cheaper every single year. And so it's really tough to compete with folks who, don't have a job and they don't really, they don't have to worry about anything else. And so that was, I knew at that point that I probably wasn't going to make a ton of money off of this particular podcast, but I love doing it. So that would evolve years later. I started up my own business. And then when I started up my own business, Digital Dispatch, I started up a separate podcast in order to talk to my customers. And that was the main goal of that podcast. My career evolved from, a hobby perspective into, okay, well, how do I use this vehicle to talk to my customers and then develop solutions and products around the problems that they were experiencing? And that show ended up doing really well in the market that I'm in now, which is logistics and supply chain. There were very few podcasts that existed even just a handful of years ago. There's about 60 now, but it sounds like a lot, but it's really not that much when you consider the size and the scale of supply chain just as a whole. But then that evolved into becoming more popular. And now since 2023, it's evolved into the Everything is Logistics podcast. And it does very well. I could make a full-time income. I could definitely say it's a full-time income from that show. And I only get about 150 to 200 downloads per episode. Now, some episodes do considerably better than that, but that's about my average. And I think the biggest switch in this whole journey of starting up that 6-minute, commercial, dead silence, dead air show to now what I have is the value of the listener. And not to say that, sports entertainment listeners are any less valuable than a business listener, but if you have 150 people listening to your show and those 150 people are responsible for making purchasing decisions that are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, which a lot of these executives are, then the value of that listener is significantly more. And when the value of that listener and the action that they potentially might take is very high, then you're able to command a much higher rate than I ever made. I can't even think of, I would say quadruple, but that's not even what's quadruple of what I made in sports and entertainment. I now make with a logistics podcast. And I don't think a lot of podcasters are thinking about it from that lens. Like you might work in quote unquote, traditionally boring environment, boring industry, but the value of that listener might be very significant where it could offer you life-changing money.
I guess we should also give a warning to our listeners that you're going to have a lot of mic drop moments. Blythe is out here just stunting. Okay, no, that was really good. I guess I should share why I podcast.
Yeah, because you've been podcasting longer than me. And that's how we met, was through your podcast.
And that's a story for another episode. I podcast. Why do I podcast? Because I am insane and I love the sound of my voice, apparently. Can't get enough of it. Jokingly. I say that jokingly, obviously, but I think there's a little bit of narcissism that goes into being a podcaster, right? Like you feel like your opinion, your voice, whatever it may be, is worthy of getting it out there. And you value your opinion. So, you put in the work to get it out there. So I think there's a little bit of narcissism. It can be good or bad, but I like to think that, it's good in this way. So I'll make mine pretty brief because mine is super nerdy. I currently run the Shortbox podcast. It is one of the longest running weekly comic book podcasts in the industry. I've been doing it since 2012. And it started just as a fun hobby. My original co-host, Walter Gant and Andrew Torres, Walt was on another podcast and like super early. He was like, the podcast he was on was my first introduction to podcasting. It was called The Side Hustle. It was comedic. It was, him and 3 other friends got together every Friday night over drinks, talked about work and just sports and politics. I consumed every episode, even though I saw Walt every week. I was like his first fanboy. I was like, oh, and then in episode 3, you said this. And he's like, nerd, shut up. But at some point, Walt also shared a passion for comic books and movies and music. And he had the opportunity to do a spin-off show using the same equipment. And he invited myself and the other co-host, Andrew Torres, on the show. And we launched the Shortbox. And it had no direction. We had a loose format. I mean, it was just, you know how it is. It's just early podcasting and, your first attempt. So you don't know what you're doing, but it was so much fun. I look forward to it. Every Sunday we'd record. We would talk about at that time, me and Drew were working at a comic shop, and Walt would come in every week. So we just talked about the books we picked up, the movies we were watching. We all had a similar taste in music. So, it's just our chance to like meet up and vent and talk and joke. And then at some point, Walt and Drew ended up leaving Jax for, job opportunities. Drew was in the military. And, that was a very pivotal moment or crossroads where it was like, do I continue the podcast or do I just stop it? But I decided to continue it, changed up the co-host, brought in some other friends on board. And I mean, honestly, the podcast has gone through like 2, 3, 4, 5 different iterations in terms of co-hosts and, how it runs and things like that. But it's been probably one of the best things I could have ever started on or ever done. Why do I still podcast? Well, instead of it just being a passion hobby, it still is, but now it gave me the opportunity to start my own small business, my own LLC, and really ingrain myself in the industry. Instead of just talking about the industry, I found the opportunity to like get myself ingrained in it, to meet amazing and extremely talented writers and artists that I've followed for years, the opportunity to work with publishers to promote, the latest books they've got. I've been, I can go to conventions and do panels and host things and meet other, industry folks. So I think the reason why I still podcast is because I know I'm not artistically talented. I can't draw worth crap. I can't write a story or a book, but I can conduct a good interview. I think I can shoot the shit with the best of them. And I love having a platform that allows me to, be ingrained in this industry and this hobby that I've loved since a kid. So any small contribution that I could do on my part, whether it be to help someone, get their story out there or whatnot, I think that's why I still podcast. And to me, I think it's one of the best mediums out there, right? Like you're highlighting the power of conversation and talking. And I think in this day and age where a lot of things are just done digital via IMs, DMs, etc., that maybe we've lost some of that art of conversation and talking. So I think podcasting is just a fantastic medium, and I think that's why I still podcast. It's a lot of fun, and it's elevated my hobbies to another level.
I think that's sort of speaks to like the testament of like, don't be afraid to let your show evolve into the way that it should evolve. You don't have to be, you don't have to start out, knowing everything. I mean, we started this show. I don't even think we have an official title for this show, but we knew it was important, or an official podcast name.
Yeah. And so one of our listeners can help us decide on a better name other than the new JPU. That's what we're running with. But you're right. I think that maybe that speaks to another reason why we're going to do a more consistent recording and release schedule is that, I had the opportunity to talk to one of our mutual friends, Tony Smilagic, and, we were trying to brainstorm what is the next phase. Well, speaking about next phases like JPU, right? The Jax Podcasters United is kind of in this interesting space where we're trying to figure out what's the next iteration look like. We can't keep doing the same old thing. And in talking with Tony, he brought up, why don't you guys make a podcast for it? And it's like, oh, but you don't know how hard it is. We already do podcasts. And I liked the challenge that he gave, the pushback, which was, but do a podcast where if you had the opportunity to correct all the mistakes and, take everything you've learned into something new, like, it should be easier, right? And that was a big driving force, I think, to doing this. So to go back to your point, yeah, don't be afraid to change things up, to lean into a new chapter. That is one thing with me doing more remote shows and interviews. It really made me step up, the sound quality, the technology, the equipment that I've got, and like really kind of learn how to conduct better interviews.
I think it's also not the psychological nature of not relying on your co-hosts. It takes, I think it's, in my head, it's a lot easier to host a show solo. It's a lot, I can sit down at a mic and I can record a few hours, just me talking. No one wants to listen to that, but I could do it if I needed to. And I would say that there's a lot of, especially with a lot of the people that we talk to, so some of the excuses that pop up is, well, my co-host can't record, or they, had a baby and they're we had to put the show on pause. And if I'm them, I'm not letting my co-host dictate the future of the show that I'm a part of. I am full steam ahead. Hopefully we can find some room for you, but if you can't keep up, It's time to
I think
keep
that's
it going.
I do agree that a solo show allows you to be more agile. There isn't, you don't have to bounce ideas or get approvals. But I think in my case where I built the show on having co-hosts and that was the vibe, that was the show, friends laughing, sharing jokes and, building like our own kind of like inner lore. It was very weird to make the transition to do more solo stuff because that's what the listeners were used to. Oh man, I love when you and Ed cracked a joke on you, and oh man, when you guys get together, like that was the show. So it almost felt like I was betraying like what we built. But I think I got lucky where life dictated that, hey, it's got to be this. Now, granted, that's not to say they're not a part of it. They're always, their spirits in it 100%. But yeah, I do find it pretty cool to be in this position where I'm a little more agile. I can stack up and bank episodes. It's not really relying on everyone being there together. So yeah, I think it's an interesting phase for my show personally. And I'm seeing like, a lot of pros, and then there's some things that I kind of wish I had codes for.
But I think it also just comes back to, well, what's your personal ROI?
Mhm.
And to bring it, I guess, sort of full circle of, why podcasts start and then fail, or why do they have so much trouble if they're not on YouTube? And, obviously that's discoverability is a big issue. Some other platforms like Spotify are trying to solve that issue. But YouTube ultimately is a place where you can be discovered. And then everything ties kind of back into, well, what's your personal ROI? Originally back in the day, my personal ROI was just revenge. Not revenge. But it definitely fueled me into, you think I can't be on every day? I'll show you, like type of mentality. Yeah. And then, I was talking about topics that I really cared about. They were hobby topics, probably not going to make any money from it. But I did get a lot of connections from that. And it turned into, and it kept snowballing over the years into more and more opportunities. And then when the light bulb switch just happened, that's when everything changed. And so now, I have the help that I've always dreamed of, and I can, record a show and then hand it off to a team and they can take care of the editing for me. I can still do it if I need to. I don't want to. And so I think that's, the ROI evolving for me over the years has been such a game changer where, before I was getting opportunities with the Jaguars, with the PGA Tour, and even other NFL teams, and, being able to, sort of be in situations where as a fan, you dream about, and you can't believe you're in those different situations. And then now it's evolved into, well, this is a business for me and I treat it as such. And, I have to think about it from the lens of people want to come on the show, but I have to justify the spend of, it costs me about $180 in order from the back end perspective in order to edit the show and get it distributed out from the, the rates that I pay for editing and things like that. And so I have to ask myself, is this topic worth it enough to my audience to invest that money on that episode? And so, things have changed, things have evolved and upgraded, and, it's a different set of problems, but it feels really good to work in a job that I can continuously get better at. And I'm doing it in front of other people, and hopefully, other folks that listen to, this show and other shows that we produce can maybe gain some little nuggets of information from, and it can help them along in their journey too.
Well said. And I want to add one more thing to why podcasts, and then I want to move on to this next topic that's related. But I think you said opportunities, and I think that's a big driving factor for me now. I think somewhere in my going on, I think 12 or 13 years now, somewhere in there, when I started seeing, the ability to make money off podcasting, I definitely wanted this to be my full-time job. I was like, oh, wow, there's, I could make some serious money off of it. And then I think the reality set in where it's like, I don't think I'm in the right industry that would support my, the lifestyle that I'm accustomed to based on my podcast, right? Like comic books, notoriously one of the hardest artistic mediums and industries out there, money is kind of scarce in the industry as a whole. And we're talking for like, the biggest creators out there. So, what does that mean for a podcaster that's just talking about these books? So somewhere along the lines, I think the reality set in where it's like, okay, the likelihood of me making this a full-time, thing that would support me in the way that I want it to, the reality just hit. So I pivoted to opportunities where it's like, okay, well, if I can't make a living off of this, can I, make enough to cover my expenses of creating the podcast? Can I make enough money to cover the books that I'm buying to review and talk about? Can I make enough money to cover, the streaming apps and the software that I have to use and buy and keep up to date with? And then eventually I started getting bigger aspirations where it's like, okay, can I go to like these awesome conventions I've never been to? I've only dreamed about going. San Diego Comic-Con, New York Comic-Con. Can I go there and get invited and not have to pay a ticket? Can I host a panel with, these writers and artists that I'm trying to get on the show? Can I get in front of publishers? And that's where, once I shifted my mindset, instead of strictly looking for monetary gain, I think that really reinforced why I podcast. It gave me like a new fire, a new drive, where it's like, okay, I'm going to try to do all the things that a comic fan, a pop culture fan has always wanted to do, and try to do it for free. Can I build a reputation in the industry as, someone that, as you as a creator, you got to go on the short box. You got to, you haven't talked to Badr yet? Oh, he's great. You got to talk to him. So I think once I, started looking outside of just your basic monetary gain and making money, it opened up a whole world and gave me a whole new drive.
And so what are you, I guess, what does success look like for you right now? Is going to conventions and recording content there, making connections
I think
for future guests?
I think amplifying what I'm doing to the next level, where it is like I am becoming a name within the industry that is recognizable, that, I'm on PR lists for different publishers, and I'm definitely there, but I definitely want to see what that next. And I think for me too, if it being such a unique industry, such a niche industry being comic books, I think I'm in a position to create something for myself, because, there isn't, you know what I'm saying? Like there's a lot of opportunities, and I'm not quite sure what that next level is, because I don't know if anyone else has done it. So it's a good position to be in, where it's like, okay, what is, can I imagine something to build towards?
Yeah, and I think that's probably a really good segue into our next topic, because this is actually your topic. So for folks who may just be tuning in, I'm going to add that link, or I'm going to send that link to you for the YouTube video in order to add it to the show notes, because we're about to be on all the podcast apps, of course on YouTube as well, because it helps with discoverability. But in case anybody wants to check out some of the videos or the topics that we're discussing, you can, watch those more in depth. But that kind of, it's a good chance to segue into your topic, which is, very relevant to what you were just discussing.
Yeah. So the topic I wanted to bring to the table today is related to something I did this past weekend, which is, and relates to like why I podcast, like some of the goals, which is being able to go to conferences, host panels, get in front of like the right people. This past weekend, in our hometown of Jacksonville, there was a comic book pop culture convention called Collective Con. It was its 10-year anniversary, so big deal. It's been really cool to watch this convention grow and draw the attention of fans, as well as the industry and celebrities and guests. So I had the opportunity once again, I think this is my second or third year, of hosting a panel. They normally in the past have let me do like interviews with the celebrities for their main channel, which kind of speaks to, I was only given those opportunities because of the podcast that I built. It's a track record, right? Hey, here's my resume. I've interviewed, XYZ in the past. I'm okay being in front of an audience. I can speak eloquently. I can ask good questions. So that was something that, I was able to use the podcast for opportunities, and also just kind of tie it back. Now, full transparency, there was no money involved in it. They weren't paying me. I don't think I'm there at that level. I think that's another goal of mine, is to be able to be paid for those services. But the trade-off in this case was the ability to like get content that I probably wouldn't be able to on my own, right? There are some guests and celebrities that just don't do podcasts. I mean, how many times have you run into, but maybe not so much in your case, but I know in my case, I'm dealing with artistic types that have massive deadlines, and any time that they're not in front of a computer or drawing or whatnot is time wasted. It's like, no, I'll let the PR handle that. So going to conventions and offering my services in terms of, hey, I'll host your channel, or I'll host these interviews, or I'll do a panel. I always build in, if you're not paying me, let me get the content. Let me get a copy of the content. Let me put it on the podcast. It looks good for you. It looks good for me. It's something my audience will appreciate. So so it was a great convention this past weekend. I got to host a really great panel. I had 3 panelists that I didn't even, quite frankly, I'm sure I could have maybe reached out to them, but I know one individual told me right after, hey, that was a great panel. I don't do podcasts or interviews. So I was a little hesitant, but I've heard your other shows and I said, why not? I'll do the panel. So what I'm saying is there's opportunities that if your podcast is about a certain industry or a niche topic, like think about the conferences that are either close to you, maybe take place in your hometown, or ones that you're, willing to drive or travel to, and see, how you can get in where you fit in, for lack of better terms. I found that applying to, these conventions are always looking for content, especially in my field.
They need media help.
Exactly. They're always looking for content. And in my field with comic conventions, they're always looking for people to do live shows, host a panel, and a lot of times bring a panel idea to them, because they've got, 3-4 days to fill with content. They've got a whole convention center with rooms that they need to fill, and, bodies they need to get in certain rooms. So, that's, I always find that's an easy way to get your foot in the door with certain conferences that might be a little pricey. New York Comic Con was something I got to do last year. It's been on my bucket list for years. Could I have afforded to go? Yeah, I could have. I could have paid the whatever $100 or a couple $100 to get the tickets and then the airline tickets. But I submitted a panel application and I got the tickets in for free. I was able to use that content, build some hype around it. I got to meet new listeners in person at the conference. So I find that conference is a great tool for podcasters that have a focus or an industry that has a rich conference ecosystem. And I know in your case, conferences are abundant in your case for logistics and trucking. Like, what opportunities have you taken advantage of when it comes to conferences and working in your podcast and such?
I wish I would have done more conferences when I was in sports and entertainment, because I feel like it is such an unlock. Not only is because, from the networking perspectives, whenever you're going to these shows, but like you said, these events are looking for media. They want PR and attention on their events. And the people who are going to the events, the people who have booths at the events, and the people who are sponsoring the events, because then they can go back to all of their sponsors who are spending money with them, and they could say, we got you this amount of coverage from these different creators, and they have X amount of followers and subscribers and, whatever else. It looks good to them. And so for a lot of my time that I've spent I've been in logistics for more than a decade, but I've only been going to conferences with the intent to record content since 2019, I think was my first 2018. Late 2018 was my first logistics conference, because I chose to leave sports radio in 2019. And thank God I left in 2019, because we all know what happened to sports in 2020. But that was such an unlock, because not only are you networking with everybody there, but like you said, you're able to go there and record content with people that you probably would be very challenging to meet in person, would be very challenging to get them on a show if they've never met you. For example, I've been doing this show now for, Everything is Logistics, for a little over a year, completely independent. But there are people that are very high, like a head of supply chain in North America for Alibaba, is a major e-commerce platform, shipper, customer. I would have never been able to get a meeting with them without the podcast. And because of the podcast, I was able to secure a meeting at a conference. They can find out that I'm not a weirdo, that, I'm professional, and you can have a quick 10-minute conversation. But that 10-minute conversation was introduced because of the podcast. And now that person is going to be able to come on my show because I wasn't a weirdo whenever I met them. And so being able to get these high profile guests on the show is almost like, I guess to sort of signal back to you and your show, it's like Thanos collecting, all the Infinity Stones. Like I want to be able to have these high profile conversations in order to break down these information silos. But a lot of the times you can't get that introduction unless you're going to these conferences. And so I think for maybe a lot of folks out there who may not be going to conferences, who may not be even thinking about that aspect yet, you have no idea how many local events go on in and around your city. Eventbrite is a perfect tool to use to scout out. There's another website called 10 Times that I subscribe to as well, and it's free. But you can sign up for a conference. You can get a weekly notification of all of the events that are going on in your industry and outside of your industry once a week. And so being able to utilize these different mechanisms to meet new people, especially locally, is such a huge unlock. Now, another unlock is if you're already, sort of dead set in an industry and that's where you're hyper focused and there are conferences and events going on, check out the sponsor page for each of those conferences, because if you're trying to make money off of your show, which most people are trying to make money off of their show, the secret unlock is looking up these different conferences and checking out the sponsor page to see who is supporting that conference. Because if they're supporting that conference, then they got money to spend. And if they got money to spend, then they're trying to reach that same audience you're trying to reach. And so that is a perfect sales outreach campaign. Or I know several people who work in logistics, and they almost treat it conferences as a battle plan, where they will print out the trade show floor map and then highlight the sponsors and then make sure that they connect with those sponsors before the conference takes place. And then at the conference, they will go to that sponsor booth, or they'll go to that person who is spending money at that conference and just introduce themselves. And don't make it a sales pitch, but they're just building those connections. So then that way, when they get home from the conference, they can shoot over their contact information. Hey, it was great to meet you. Great checking out your booth. They have something to talk about other than, hey, you should give me money. And so it's just a different level of unlocking where that company is spending money. That's a target audience that they're trying to reach. And if you have a show in that industry, then chances are there's a higher chance of opportunity that they would be willing to spend money with you. And it's going to be a situation where hopefully it makes sense for you and your audience and the brand, and sort of that Venn diagram of what makes sense for all three of those different, I guess, sort of, because you are the audience, you as well, because you have to be interested in the topic if you're going to be talking about it. And then the brand wants to know that they are talking to an engaged audience that cares about the topic that they're going to be talking about. And so it's this different sort of everybody scratching their own back, but it gives you sort of that carrot at the end of the stick, right? And so that you can find incentive, whether it's to be on a panel, to go to these shows for free, to level up networking wise. But then maybe that extra next step, what that looks like, is getting someone that's already spending money to spend money with you.
Well said. Well said. And I got a lot of replies to that. But first and foremost, I got to say that maybe we should keep a track of every time you make a comic book reference and I make a sports reference. I think that'd be kind of cool. But you said something about going to these conferences and the power of face-to-face interaction and showing, hey, I'm not a weirdo, or even in a more serious way or less jokey way. It's also like, hey, here's a face to the email that I sent, and I have an anecdote to share. I think that was something that we talked about, is that we wanted this show to have, practical advice that we have used, whether it's worked or failed. And I am currently, right now, at the time of this recording, knock on wood, courting a potential sponsor. I reached out via emails. This brand new company that was coming onto the comic book scene. They have an amazing digital app that's a digital store and a digital reader, which is nice to have in the comic book world. So I reached out to them. I wanted to see about sponsorships, because they had posted something, I think, on Twitter or social media looking for, hey, we're brand new. We want to get the word out. Are there any, comic podcasts that, we should look into sponsoring? So I reached out. it was a cordial, hey, thank you, but we've already spent all of the money, this and that. And I was like, I know they'll be at New York Comic Con. I want to meet them. I started using the app. I genuinely enjoyed it. And at New York Comic Con, I knew that if they met me or if we had a face to face, it would help out a lot. And that's kind of how it happened. I got to meet them in person. I really got to pick their brains and hear their story and, show them that I cared and supported. And I don't think we talked much about business. I knew that I don't want to like reiterate and repitch. It was just, I would just want to meet face to face. And I actually had the CEO on the podcast this week, and it just naturally came up like, hey, let's pick back up about a potential sponsorship. And I would not have been able to get that opportunity had I not gone to that conference and had the face to face. Because I mean, you think about like how many emails they probably got off that one tweet, or just in general, how many emails we all get, and unless you can put a face to it, it's a lot easier to ignore or delete an email. And I think for podcasters, that's where the power of conferences come from, where you're not only getting in front of the right people. I think there's also a reputation builder there too. You're at a conference that everyone else is at, that like all the big dogs and top names of your industry are at. I think there's a little bit of that reputation where it's like, oh, if they're here, they're serious about this. They're serious about their craft, the industry, et cetera. And then obviously as a podcaster trying to always grow their show and get new fans, the people that show up at these conferences are your target demo. You know what I'm saying? Like someone that doesn't care about comics isn't going to go spend all that money and time and energy to go to a comic conference. So you know what I'm saying? There's just so many bonuses and plus. Now, granted, that is if you can afford it and make that happen. But I think maybe that's why you start off, your local hometown, ones that don't require a lot of resources and time and effort. And then you work your way up to the big ones. And I was thinking too, I don't know if it's something you said or it just came to mind, but if you're having a hard time maybe figuring out what conferences are available, because there's conferences to this day where I'm like, wait, there's one in
There's so many.
Wait, there's one in here? I think a strategy I would recommend is think about someone that you want to interview. What is your A-list or wish guest that you wish you could have on? I find a lot of times in my case, writers and artists will include in their bio or their, name, hey, Badr, I'll be at New York Comic Con 2024. I think a lot of talent, especially in
a lot
in the
of
world,
cosplayers do that, where they'll say like,
they'll
oh, my
announce.
next, they'll put it in like their Instagram bio, like my next con is this such and such date.
Yeah. One thing I do every year is I sit down and I look up every single conference, all the major big comic book conferences, and I just write down the dates so I can get an idea of like, all right, can I realistically make this? Who was there last year? I look at like last year's guest list, and a lot of times you'll see like recurring names, but I think doing a little bit of prep work and strategizing and seeing what's going to give you the most ROI is also a really good way. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunities, like I said, not only to get guests, future guests and content and potential listeners and fans, but also from the monetary gain. Having a face-to-face and being able to sell and pitch in person, I think goes a long way other than just a cold email.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that you sort of hit the nail on the head with looking up, ones that are within driving distance that can just be a day trip. There's a lot of associations. There's for every conference, there's also an association for everything. And associations are also looking for media coverage because they want, attention on their association as well. And I think for a lot of podcasters, you think that you're just sitting behind a microphone and you don't necessarily have to get out into the world. But once you start to get out, you start to network, you start, putting a face to a name, then it becomes really hard to ignore you. And it becomes a better situation because you feel like you're making connections. You feel like you're making sort of, work friends, and you are thinking about it in a different way from a business perspective. And I think that is the shift that most podcasters need to take, or you're going to become one of the 90% that, never makes it past 10 episodes. And, I wish, the tips that I have now and the resources that I had now, I wish I would have known this years ago, because I would have been going to those sports conferences and probably entertainment conferences and things like that. I tried for years to get into E3, RIP to them. But it was just such a high milestone that you had to reach for some of those conferences, especially like E3. You had to have a certain amount of web traffic and you had to go jump through a bunch of hoops for them in order to even accept you. But your local conferences, your area events that you can just go to within driving distance, JPU events is a perfect example of that, where all of our events are free. So, well, not all of them, coming soon. That's part of our revenue plan.
There's still going to be a ton of free events, though.
Yeah, there's gonna be a free component, but we got to make money too. We've been doing this for 5 years, so that is also a reason why we're starting a podcast, is to find ways to not make it all about money, but we have put hundreds of hours of our own time into this. Podcasters listening to this have probably done the same thing with their craft. It's okay to think about how you want to make money off of it. And maybe it's not even thinking about how you want to make money off of it, but what is your ROI? Is it getting into panels? Is it interviewing your dream guests? Is it going to events that you never thought you would be able to be at and be media for those events? That's is such a huge accomplishment, to be able to go to an event and cover it as a media professional. And so just thinking about what you want your personal ROI to be, I think is just so important. And it's okay if that evolves, and it's okay if you want to eventually start charging money, for sponsorships and things like that. And, we're going to talk about all of these things in upcoming shows, because sponsorships is honestly like I feel like I could talk about the intricacies of it for sure. 6 months in a row and still have more things to discuss. But we're going to be talking about all of these different types of aspects of podcasting, because it's really important for folks to be thinking about these types of things, and not to overwhelm you, but to think about it from the lens of, this is something you're really passionate about. This is a topic that you really like discussing. Okay, well, what does that ROI look like for you? And maybe it's just talking to your customers and getting that kind of customer feedback, because you'd be surprised at how many businesses launch products and services without ever having a single conversation with a customer. And so maybe you have your own business, or maybe you're starting one internally, or whatever your situation is, there's an ROI there, and it doesn't have to be monetary based, but it's okay if it is.
I think also be ready to accept that you're going to have to grind. You're going to have to work your way up to all of these opportunities, especially when it comes to conferences, right? Like I was doing a lot of free, you probably won't be paid to do panels and things like that. I think you got to accept that, it's, you're going to be doing some things for free if you get into it. But once again, think about the potential, the opportunity, the
content you can get from it.
Exactly.
Always, if you're
content.
I will say, in my experience, I've never been paid to be a panelist. I've never been paid to be a speaker, but I always ask for the content. And because I ask for the content, I'm able to use that on my own channels, and I'm able to set up myself and market myself as an authority on that topic. But you might be paid to be an MC. You might be able to, and you might not even have to get paid. You could work and trade for, I work and trade all the time. So think about it in that lens of, if you have a certain skill set where you could offer somebody and they could offer you something in return, you could work in trade. You could share sponsorships, quote unquote sponsorships, on each other's show, where each of you record, a different commercial, or, there's lots of different ways to think about what that ROI looks like. And going to conferences is essentially meeting people, making those connections, and then developing those relationships from there in a mutually beneficial way.
I think in closing, I want you to think about why you podcast. What is your definition of success? What keeps you going? What keeps you, recording episodes and putting them out there? And then think about how you could leverage conferences for your podcast. Think about what you talk about. What is your topic, your interest? And I want you to look in and see what's the local or national conference for you, and can you get in? Can you be involved in some way? That'll be your that'll be your homework assignment for this episode. Besides that, I think we've discussed both of our main topics for this episode. We've also decided that we'll save any JPU announcements towards the end. So maybe this is where we say thank you to the listeners for tuning into the new JPU show, episode 1. And if you are in the Jacksonville or Northeast Florida area,
or want to travel,
you're always welcome. So we don't have any announcements in terms of a immediate event, we're planning that might happen sometime in Q2, but we do have 2 awesome announcements I've been dying to share. If you are a part of the if you are part of the JPU Facebook page, you probably saw me tease this, but we finally have merch for sale, or will have merch for sale, and I'm going to see if I can't pull up the image. You think I should pull up the image? You think that'll be too complicated?
Well, if not, then you can always just cut it in and post, right?
You're right. There we go. I'm going to edit this show anyways.
But it's a great design. So, it's one of those things where we really come at this, we've been doing this for a little over 5 years now. And with each of the meetups, we've put a lot of our own personal
Never had a
income.
shirt. I know.
But it's evolved into a community that is much bigger than just the 2 of us. And so we keep thinking of ways to how do we show off the incredible community that is here, because we have a ton of really big podcasting giants here in North Florida. We both went to Denver to Podcast Movement back in August, and we met was it a dozen Jacksonville either companies or podcasters that all went out to Denver to go to this conference. And so we have a lot of Jacksonville locals or North Florida locals that are powerhouses in the community. Buzzsprout, you all know and love them. But there's several other companies here. Alex over at Pod Pros, but he has so many other businesses too. Podmatch, so he has several businesses there. And just being able to network with that group and build the community that here is in North Florida, I think is a treasure. And I think being able to show off that community in person, so merch just makes a natural connection to that. And we went local, so we're getting local companies to print it. We're getting local people to design the shirt. We always host our events at a local establishment, so we know where our bread is buttered. And so we want to continue building on that. And so the shirt the design is impeccable. And so I can't wait for everyone to see it and get their reaction on it. But what are your thoughts on this new t-shirt design and new movement into merch, which isn't just the only thing we're doing. It's not just, hey, buy a t-shirt. It's, part of a growth movement for us and exploring different opportunities that the community has provided with close to 500 members now that we have.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're looking pretty strong. But yeah, this first shirt design is the first JPU piece of merch outside of the pins that we were giving away that we're offering to our members. It's going to be a limited run. We're going to do pre-orders only. We got to be financially smart about this one. But yeah, to Blythe's point, it is designed by an amazing local artist by the name of Emily Kwan, who is the wife of a fantastic local podcaster in our group. Big shout outs to Warren Evans. She is an amazing designer, Emily. So she designed our first shirt. I should have it edited here somewhere on the screen so you could take a look at it. We're going to have a pre-order page launching pretty soon. I think a couple of days after this episode posts or whatnot. All of the money, as Blythe said, goes back into the JPU, into the events we throw, and us growing this show, as well as our efforts in the JPU. So if you want to represent the Jax Podcasters United group proudly, this is your opportunity. I'll have links in this episode's show notes. We'll also post it on the Facebook group. We'll also put it in the newsletter and all of that. Second major announcement, which I've been also excited to share, is that back in December, we had our Jax Podathon event. It was the first of its kind here in Jax. It was a charity event based around podcasting, and we threw an awesome night of educational speed dating, and we also had a little booth set up where attendees could talk about their show and what their podcast is about. We have finally edited those, and we're going to start rolling those out here on the YouTube channel as part of our new effort to be more consistent with content. I think we're calling them our Podcaster Spotlight series. So every episode will feature and spotlight a different podcaster in the Jax podcast community. And we're going to start with our guy, DL Cummings, host of the Liberty Dad podcast, a longtime member of the JPU. I mean, he's been attending these events for as long as I remember. So I think he's a great way to introduce this new series. And we'll figure out a rollout and a schedule for each of them. But we've got 12 total videos for this podcast series. So we're excited to introduce a lot of you to, amazing podcasters here in our hometown. And yeah, I think that is the JPU announcements for today. So you got your shirt or pre-orders that'll be happening soon, and be on the lookout for our new Podcaster Spotlight video series.
One more important note about that Jax Podathon event, which we do plan on having, making it an annual holiday tradition, because we were able to that night it was a super rainy, windy night. It was miserable weather, but thank you to everyone who did show up to that event. We ended up raising $500 for feeding Northeast Florida, which is fantastic.
But we're gonna crush it this
charity.
Year. All right, we're gonna break that. We're gonna go above and beyond this year. That was a good start. Good start. Valiant effort, troops. But we're gonna go big this time.
This group has always been about education and entertainment at the same time, which I think is the key to success for not only events but also podcasts as well. And so with all of that, the business is growing. We are not. It is a business, and so that is the reason for some of these changes, is that we got to be frank and honest and upfront with everybody, and that is we plan to at least break even with the business. So we're not trying to get rich, but we are trying to break even and trying to do so in ways that we really have thought long and hard about, with not only from the content perspective, but also from different solutions on building up a community. I think, both of us we didn't know what we started, more than 5 years ago when this group was established. We didn't know how many creators were in this space, but the cool thing about it is that our model is working to the effect of we're now talking to other people in other cities that are doing the same thing as the JPU. And so I think the community members, you should absolutely feel proud about every event that you've showed up to, that you have supported, and just know that your efforts are, very much appreciated, and other cities and other states are starting to notice, and they're starting to replicate the same JPU model. And so I think it's in a world where we are increasingly, sort of working from home, sitting behind screens, the third places, and creating those third place moments with the JPU meetups and educational sessions is going to be vital for the growth of this community and to continue those initiatives.
Perfectly said, and I think that is what we can call this episode a wrap. The first episode of the new JPU show is in the books. Thank you guys for hanging out, for watching, for listening, and be on the lookout for more. Your last, like every podcaster does on their outro, make sure you subscribe if you're watching on YouTube or whatever podcast app you're listening to. Sign up for our newsletter, which will be happening more regularly at Jax Podcasters United.
Both. United. We probably should know that.
We got both. Okay, cool. yeah, Jax Podcasters United.com.
I'm a domain squatter.
Look, how I like to say it, all of these links will be in the show notes, so you don't got to think or memorize any URLs. Check out the show notes for all this helpful information. Pre-order a shirt, watch some of these Podcaster Spotlight series, and come back for our next episode. Peace, y'all.